common misunderstanding among Christians is that the law is contrary to the gospel of grace. Many believe that because we are saved by grace apart from works of the law, we have absolutely no obligation to obey the law. Others believe that the law is properly seen only as a threat and terror against sinners, whereas the gospel, by contrast, is what saves us after the law has condemned us. In all actuality, there are so many views about the relationship between the law and the gospel of grace that we cannot possibly mention them all. So, to counter an entire host of false notions, we will describe the biblical perspective on this relationship by focusing on what have traditionally been called the three uses of the law. Since the Protestant Reformation, theologians have frequently spoken of three different ways the law is used in Scripture. Although much agreement exists about the validity of several different uses, theologians have not always been consistent in numbering these uses. So, to avoid confusion, in these lessons we will refer to the three uses of the law in the following order. The first use of the law is the pedagogical use, or the use of the law as a teacher. When used pedagogically, the law drives men to Christ by inciting and exposing their sin and threatening punishment against it. The second use of the law is the civil use. When we use the law for a civil end, we use it to restrain sin in society. This use is sometimes associated with external discipline. The third use of the law is the normative use. This is the use of the law as a guide or rule for faithful Christians. The pedagogical or first use of the law speaks of the way God's law enlivens sin within unbelievers and shows them their need for Christ. We all know the experience of learning that something is forbidden and being drawn all the more to do it. Paul wrote about his own experience with the pedagogical use of the law in Romans chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, where he wrote these words, "I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, 'Do not covet.' But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire." This use of the law is commonly associated with the biblical teaching that believers were once under law, but are now under grace. When unbelievers are confronted by the law's standards and penalties, they're incited to sin even more, and they recognize the punishment or curse that the law threatens against them because of their sin. This threat drives some unbelievers to Christ, who graciously saves them from the law's curse. This is the idea behind Paul's words in Romans chapter 6, verse 14. "Sin shall not be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace." In this sense, the pedagogical use of the law does not apply directly to believers. Once a person has been driven to Christ, the law has finished its work in this regard. So, with regard to the pedagogical use, we are no longer under the law. The civil, or second use of the law, involves the way the law restrains sin by threatening punishment against those who violate it. We can think of ways we restrain our own behavior for fear of punishment by those who hold civil authority over us. This use of the law is for believers and unbelievers alike, and it focuses especially on God's place for civil government as an instrument for restraining evil. In future lessons, we will address many subjects related to this use of the law, so for now we will simply mention it and note that it is not incompatible with the gospel of grace. The third, or normative use of the law, however, is very helpful to study when we think about the law in terms of the gospel and Christian ethics. The normative use applies the law in the way that we have been using it in these lectures, namely as a revelation of God's will for Christian living. We might compare it to the household rules that our parents made to keep us safe, and that we obeyed because we loved and trusted our parents. For example, listen to the words of 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. John wrote these words long after Christ had ascended into heaven. Nevertheless, he asserted that the law remains the standard for our behavior. He even went so far as to define all sin in terms of breaking the law. To put it simply, the law is still the standard by which Christian behavior is judged to be righteous or sinful. And many passages indicate that when the law is used as a standard for Christian behavior, it is perfectly compatible with the gospel.